For 7 years, everyone believed little Isabella Hayes couldn't see. They were all wrong. In the suffocating heat of a Savannah summer, Ruby Mae Johnson stepped off the Greyhound bus, clutching a worn suitcase and a photograph of her dead son. The Hayes Manor loomed before her like a monument to old Southern money, its Spanish moss-draped oaks whispering secrets she couldn't yet understand. What Ruby discovered in that first week would shatter everything the Hayes family believed about their precious daughter. Hidden beneath Isabella's mattress, she found detailed pencil drawings, portraits of people the blind child had never supposedly seen. The strokes were too precise, the shadows too accurate for unseeing eyes. But it was the third drawing that made Ruby's blood run cold. A tall man in a white coat standing over a woman with golden hair, a syringe gleaming in his hand. What Ruby uncovered next would expose the most horrific betrayal in medical history. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Hayes Manor rose from the Georgia clay like something out of a fever dream, all white columns and wraparound porches that had witnessed 2 centuries of Southern secrets. The magnolia trees stood sentinel in the circular drive, their waxy blooms perfuming the thick summer air with a sweetness that couldn't quite mask the lingering scent of old money and older sins. Ruby Mae Johnson had seen plenty of big houses in her 34 years, but never one that seemed to breathe with such quiet malevolence. She clutched her cardboard suitcase tighter as Martha Washington, the head housekeeper, led her up the servants' entrance stairs. Martha's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her mahogany face lined with the kind of weariness that came from decades of saying yes sir and no ma'am to people who saw her uniform before they saw her humanity. "You mind yourself around Mr. Hayes," Martha whispered as they climbed. "He's been different since Miss Catherine passed. Colder. More distant. And that poor baby Isabella." She shook her head, lips pressed thin with unspoken grief. Samuel Hayes stood 6 feet tall in his perfectly pressed navy suit, even at 10 in the morning. His steel-gray eyes held the kind of emptiness Ruby recognized from her own mirror, the hollow look of a parent who'd lost everything that mattered. At 48, his dark hair was already streaked with silver at the temples, and deep lines etched his face like a map of sorrows. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his cultured Charleston accent making her name sound foreign in his mouth. "I trust your journey was adequate." The dismissal in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Ruby had heard it before. That particular brand of polite condescension reserved for the help. She straightened her shoulders beneath the crisp black uniform Martha had given her, the white apron starched to military precision. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hayes." "Thank you for the opportunity." Isabella Hayes sat motionless in the sunroom like a porcelain doll someone had forgotten to animate. 7 years old and small for her age, she wore a pristine white dress that seemed to glow against the dark leather chair. Her blonde hair fell in perfect ringlets around a face so pale it was almost translucent. The white cane leaning against her chair looked too big for her tiny hands. "Isabella has been blind since birth," Sam explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Genetic optic nerve damage. The doctors say there's nothing to be done." He paused, watching his daughter with an expression Ruby couldn't quite read. She doesn't respond much since the accident. But Ruby noticed things others missed. How Isabella's head turned slightly toward the sound of her voice. How the child's breathing changed when Ruby hummed softly under her breath. Most tellingly, how Isabella's fingers tapped against her chair arm in perfect rhythm to a tune only she could hear. Something wasn't right in Hayes Manor, and Ruby Mae Johnson intended to find out what. Ruby's first morning at Hayes Manor began before dawn, just as it had for every day of her adult life. The servants' quarters were sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window, that looked out over the kitchen gardens where tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. She placed the only photograph she owned on the nightstand. Marcus, at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the wooden cross she'd carved for him during his final weeks at the hospital. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, touching the frame with calloused fingers that still remembered the weight of her son's hand in hers. Martha Washington found her in the kitchen at 5:30, already dressed in the crisp black uniform with its pristine white apron. The older woman nodded approvingly as she handed Ruby a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "You remind me of myself 40 years ago," Martha said, settling her considerable frame into a wooden chair. "Full of hope and determination. This house has a way of wearing that down, child. Don't let it." The warning proved prophetic within hours. Ruby encountered the other staff, a shifting collection of day workers and part-time help who regarded her with the particular mixture of suspicion and pity reserved for newcomers. She'd been through this before, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the subtle exclusion from shared meals and gossip. "Another one won't last a month," she heard Cook Mary Bell mutter to the gardener. "That child upstairs is cursed, mark my words, ain't natural the way she sits there like a little ghost." But Ruby had lived through worse than whispered superstitions. She'd buried her only child and lost everything that mattered. A few gossiping house staff couldn't touch the armor of grief that protected her now. Her real education began when Sam Hayes introduced her to Isabella. The child sat in the sunroom like something carved from ivory, her blue eyes staring sightlessly toward the garden where hummingbirds darted between the jasmine blossoms. The white cane beside her chair seemed more prop than tool, too pristine for regular use. "Isabella, this is Mrs. Johnson," Sam said, his voice carrying that careful tone adults used around broken things. "She'll be helping take care of you." The child didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. But Ruby noticed the subtle shift in her breathing, the way her small fingers pressed slightly harder against the chair's leather arms. Someone was listening, even if they pretended not to be. Over the following days, Ruby settled into the rhythm of the house. She learned that Sam Hayes left each morning at exactly 7:15, his navy suit pressed to perfection, his grief worn like another piece of clothing. She discovered that Martha had worked for the Hayes family for 37 years, long enough to remember when the house rang with laughter instead of echoing with emptiness. Most importantly, she began to understand that Isabella Hayes was the most carefully observed, unobserved child she'd ever encountered. The first strange discovery came on her 3rd day. Ruby was changing Isabella's bed linens when her hand encountered something stiff beneath the mattress. She pulled out a piece of paper, expensive drawing paper, the kind used for real art. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The drawing was done in pencil, every line deliberate and precise. It showed 3 figures, a tall man in dark clothing, a woman with flowing hair, and a small child. The details were extraordinary. The way the man's jacket fell across his shoulders, the exact curl of the woman's hair, the child's expression of pure terror. No blind person could have drawn this. No child who had never seen faces could capture emotion with such devastating accuracy. Ruby's hands trembled as she slid the paper back into its hiding place. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Had Isabella's blindness been misdiagnosed? Was she pretending? And if so, why? The answer began to reveal itself in increments like a photograph developing in slow motion. Ruby noticed how Isabella navigated the house with unusual confidence for someone supposedly seeing nothing. The child never bumped into furniture, never reached tentatively for doorknobs or handrails. Her movements had the fluid certainty of someone who knew exactly where everything was. On the 5th day, Ruby conducted her own small test. While cleaning Isabella's room, she quietly moved a small chair from its usual position beside the window. When Isabella entered later, She walked directly around it without pause, as if she'd seen the change. Then, realizing what she'd done, the child deliberately walked into the chair, knocking it over with a crash that brought Martha running. "Oh, honey child, are you hurt?" Martha fussed, helping Isabella to her feet. Isabella's performance was flawless. The confused expression, the tentative reaching, the perfectly calibrated stumble. But Ruby had seen the truth in that split second before the act began. Isabella Hayes could see perfectly well. The implications hit Ruby like a physical blow. If Isabella wasn't blind, then someone was perpetuating an enormous lie. But who? And more terrifying, why? That evening, Ruby sat in her small room with Marcus's photograph in her lap, trying to make sense of what she'd discovered. Her son had died because she couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved him. She'd lost her nursing career when she'd tried to speak truth to power about inadequate care for poor children. Now she'd stumbled into another situation where a child needed protection, where adults with power were failing in their most basic duty. She thought about the drawing hidden beneath Isabella's mattress, about the fear captured in those pencil strokes. A child didn't pretend to be blind without reason. A child didn't hide artwork depicting terror unless there was something to be terrified of. Ruby made her decision with the same quiet determination that had carried her through losing Marcus, through poverty, through the destruction of her professional life. She would protect Isabella Hayes even if it cost her everything. Again. "I won't fail another child," she whispered to Marcus's photograph. "Not this time, baby boy. Mama's going to make this right." Outside her window, the Georgia night settled over Hayes Manor like a shroud, full of secrets and shadows. But in her small room, Ruby Mae Johnson began to plan. She had discovered that nothing in this house was what it seemed, and she intended to find out why a 7-year-old girl was so frightened that she'd chosen to live in self-imposed darkness, rather than face whatever truth her seeing eyes had witnessed. Ruby woke to the sound of piano music drifting through the floorboards like a ghost's lament. The melody was hauntingly beautiful. Chopin's Minute Waltz, played with the kind of technical precision that took years to master. She glanced at her bedside clock. 2:30 in the morning. The music was coming from somewhere deep in the house, somewhere she'd never been allowed to explore. Wrapping her cotton robe around her shoulders, Ruby crept down the servants' staircase, following the sound through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Hayes ancestors. The music led her to a door she'd assumed was a closet, unmarked, painted the same cream color as the walls, designed to be invisible. But behind that door lay stairs descending into darkness, and at the bottom, a room that shouldn't exist. The basement had been converted into something extraordinary, a music room with rich burgundy walls, expensive rugs, and a magnificent grand piano that gleamed like black water under soft lighting. And seated at the bench, her small hands dancing across the keys with impossible skill, was Isabella Hayes. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the blind child navigate complex passages without sheet music, her blue eyes focused intently on the keyboard. This wasn't the hesitant pecking of a beginner. This was the work of someone who had been playing for years, someone who could see every key, every pedal, every nuance of the instrument. When the final notes faded into silence, Ruby stepped forward. "Isabella, honey, how long have you been able to see?" The child's hands froze above the keys. For a moment she sat perfectly still, as if hoping she could disappear into the shadows. Then, slowly, she turned to face Ruby with eyes that were far too old for her 7-year-old face. "Since Mama went to heaven," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. "But the doctor man said bad things happen to little girls who tell secrets." The words hit Ruby like a physical blow. "What doctor man, sweetheart?" Isabella's face crumpled with terror so pure it made Ruby's chest ache. "Dr. Whitmore, he gave Mama the sleeping medicine, and she never woke up. He said if I tell anybody what I saw, he'll give me the sleeping medicine too, and I'll go to sleep forever like Mama did." Ruby sank onto the piano bench beside the trembling child, her mind reeling. Catherine Hayes hadn't died in a car accident. She'd been murdered. And Isabella had witnessed it all, had been living in self-imposed blindness for 3 years, terrified into silence by the man who was supposed to heal her. "Oh, baby girl," Ruby whispered, gathering Isabella into her arms. The child felt impossibly fragile, like a bird with broken wings. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm going to protect you." But even as she spoke the words, Ruby knew the magnitude of what she was facing. Dr. Edmund Whitmore was a respected physician, a pillar of Savannah society. She was a black woman with no credentials, no proof, and a history of speaking out against authority. Who would believe her? The next morning, Ruby waited until Sam left for work before approaching him in his study. The room smelled of leather and expensive whiskey, its walls lined with law books and business awards that spoke of generations of Hayes' success. Sam sat behind his massive mahogany desk, still wearing yesterday's grief like a second skin. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby began, her voice steady despite her racing pulse, "I need to talk to you about Isabella." Sam looked up from his paperwork with the kind of weary patience reserved for servants who overstep their bounds. "If this is about her diet or sleep schedule, you can discuss it with Martha." "It's about her sight, sir. Isabella can see." The words landed in the room like stones thrown into still water. Sam's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something that looked dangerously close to anger. "That's impossible," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Dr. Whitmore examined her thoroughly after Catherine's death. The trauma caused additional damage to her optic nerves. She's completely blind." Ruby pulled the hidden drawing from her apron pocket, the one showing 3 figures locked in some terrible drama. "She drew this, Mr. Hayes. No blind person could capture details like this." Sam studied the paper with the intensity of a man examining evidence in a murder trial. Ruby watched his face change as he recognized the figures, himself, his wife, his daughter. But instead of revelation, she saw denial settling over his features like armor. "You've been here 1 week," Sam said, his cultured voice turning cold, "and you think you know better than specialists who've treated our family for generations? Dr. Whitmore has been Isabella's physician since birth. He delivered her, diagnosed her condition, and has provided nothing but compassionate care." The dismissal stung, but Ruby pressed on. "Sir, with respect, have you ever asked Isabella herself? Have you ever listened to what she might be trying to tell you?" "Isabella doesn't speak coherently," Sam snapped, standing abruptly. "She hasn't since the accident. She lives in a world of fantasy and confusion, and I won't have you encouraging her delusions with your own wishful thinking." The pause before wishful thinking was loaded with unspoken judgment. Ruby heard the subtext clearly. "You're a woman who lost a child, projecting your grief onto mine. You don't have the education or credentials to understand medical complexities. You're just the help." "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said quietly, "I know you love your daughter. I know you want what's best for her. But what if you're wrong? What if the person you trust most has been lying to you?" Sam's face hardened completely. "Dr. Whitmore has been this family's physician for 30 years. He held me when I was born, treated my mother through her final illness, and guided us through Catherine's death. I won't have you, someone I hired a week ago, questioning his integrity or his medical expertise." Ruby felt the familiar sting of being dismissed by someone who saw her uniform before her intelligence. her skin color before her compassion, but she thought of Isabella's terrified whisper, of the fear in those two old eyes, and she found the courage to continue. All I'm asking is that you watch her, really watch her. See how she moves through this house, how she reacts to things. And maybe, just maybe, ask yourself why a 7-year-old would choose to live in darkness unless she was more afraid of what she might see in the light. For a moment something flickered in Sam's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the faintest recognition of truth. But then his protective walls slammed back into place and Ruby saw the conversation was over. "I appreciate your concern," Sam said, the word concern delivered like an insult. "But Dr. Whitmore has scheduled another evaluation for Isabella next week. I trust his professional judgment over the amateur observations of someone who, frankly, may be projecting her own grief onto my daughter." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Ruby felt the familiar burn of injustice, the helpless rage of being right but powerless to prove it. She thought of Marcus lying in that hospital bed, of all the doctors who had dismissed her questions, her intuition, her mother's knowledge of her own child. "Yes, sir," Ruby said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "I understand." But as she left Sam's study, Ruby made a silent vow. She would find proof, gather evidence, and protect Isabella Hayes, even if it meant standing alone against the entire weight of Southern propriety and medical authority. She'd failed to save her own son, but she would not fail this child. That evening, Ruby sat in her room researching Dr. Edmund Whitmore on her phone, using the Manor's Wi-Fi to dig into public records and medical board databases. What she found made her blood run cold. Multiple malpractice suits, all settled quietly out of court, a pattern of wealthy patients dying under mysterious circumstances, and buried deep in medical journals, research papers about inducing temporary blindness through pharmaceutical intervention. Ruby stared at the screen until her eyes burned, pieces of a horrifying puzzle falling into place. Tomorrow she would begin gathering the evidence that would either save Isabella Hayes or destroy Ruby Mae Johnson completely. The next morning brought Dr. Edmund Whitmore to Hayes Manor like a storm cloud rolling across the Georgia sky. Ruby watched from the kitchen window as his black Mercedes pulled into the circular drive, its polished surface reflecting the Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oaks. The man who emerged was exactly what she'd expected from her research. Tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the kind of authority that came from 40 years of never being questioned. Martha Washington bustled around the kitchen, preparing the tea service with nervous energy. "Dr. Whitmore always takes his tea in the blue room," she muttered, polishing already spotless silver. "Earl Grey, 2 sugars, thin lemon slice. Been the same for 30 years. Ruby studied the older woman's face, noting the tension around her eyes. "You've known him a long time." "Too long, child. Too long." Martha's voice carried a weight of unspoken history. "That man delivered every Hayes child for 3 generations, held their secrets, tended their sorrows, buried their dead. In this house, his word is gospel." But Ruby had learned to read between the lines of Southern politeness. There was something Martha wasn't saying, some knowledge carefully buried beneath decades of discretion. Before she could probe further, the kitchen door swung open and Samuel Hayes appeared, his navy suit immaculate as always, but his face carrying new lines of stress. "Dr. Whitmore is here for Isabella's monthly examination," Sam announced, though his eyes avoided Ruby's. "Please ensure we're not disturbed." Ruby nodded, her heart racing as she watched Sam disappear back down the hallway. This was her chance to observe, to see how Isabella reacted to the man she claimed to fear. She positioned herself in the dining room, ostensibly polishing the massive mahogany table, but with a clear view of the blue room where the examination would take place. "Doctor." Whitmore's voice carried through the partially open door, smooth and cultured with the kind of Charleston accent that turned every word into honey. "How has our little angel been, Samuel? Any changes in her behavior?" Ruby strained to hear Sam's response, catching fragments about new staff and unusual observations. Her blood chilled when she heard Whitmore's reply. Sometimes, well-meaning people can project their own experiences onto vulnerable children. Grief does strange things to judgment. The examination itself was a masterpiece of theater. Through the doorway, Ruby watched Isabella perform her blindness with the skill of a seasoned actress. She stumbled when guided to the chair, reached tentatively for objects placed in her hands, and maintained the vacant stare that had convinced everyone for 3 years. But Ruby noticed what others missed: the slight tension in Isabella's shoulders, the way her breathing quickened when Whitmore's hand touched her face, the almost imperceptible flinch when he spoke directly to her. "Such a brave little soldier," Whitmore murmured, his fingers tilting Isabella's chin upward. "The trauma to her optical nerves was quite severe, Samuel. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be kinder to consider residential care. There are excellent facilities that specialize in cases like hers." Ruby's grip tightened on her polishing cloth. Residential care meant taking Isabella away from anyone who might ask questions, might notice inconsistencies. It was the perfect solution for someone with secrets to hide. "I couldn't bear to send her away," Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's all I have left of Catherine." Of course. But think of Isabella's quality of life. Proper therapists, structured programs, other children with similar challenges. Whitmore's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "I only mention it because her condition seems to be regressing. The new medications I prescribed last month should have shown some improvement in her anxiety levels." Ruby's blood turned to ice. What medications? She'd been responsible for Isabella's care for over a week and hadn't administered anything beyond basic vitamins. Unless... The realization hit her like a physical blow. The monthly visits, the private examinations, the injections that Martha mentioned Whitmore gave Isabella for her nerves. Ruby had assumed they were standard treatments, but what if they weren't? What if those injections were designed to keep Isabella compliant, confused, or worse? After Whitmore left, Ruby found Isabella in her usual spot in the sunroom, sitting unnaturally still in the leather chair. But something was different. The child's eyes had a glassy quality. Her breathing was shallow, and when Ruby spoke her name, Isabella's response was delayed, sluggish. "Isabella, honey, how do you feel?" "Sleepy," the child mumbled, her words slightly slurred. "The doctor man gave me medicine. He said it would help me feel better, but I feel funny." Ruby's nursing instincts kicked into high gear. She'd seen this before in the hospital. The telltale signs of sedation, of someone fighting off the effects of powerful medication. Her hands shook as she checked Isabella's pulse, finding it slower than normal, thready beneath her fingertips. "What did the medicine look like, sweetheart?" "Clear stuff, in a needle." He said it was vitamins, but it hurt, and now everything feels like I'm underwater. Isabella's head lolled against the chair back, her usual sharp intelligence dimmed by pharmaceutical fog. That evening, Ruby made a decision that would change everything. After ensuring Isabella was safely asleep in her room, she used her phone to call the one person who might believe her story, Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatrician she'd worked with years ago in Atlanta. Sarah had always respected Ruby's instincts, had mourned with her when Ruby lost her nursing license for speaking out against hospital policies that endangered poor children. "Ruby, my God, I haven't heard from you since Marcus's funeral. How are you holding up?" The familiar voice brought tears to Ruby's eyes. "Sarah, I need your help. I think a child is being medically abused, but no one will listen to me." Over the next hour, Ruby laid out everything she'd discovered. Isabella's fake blindness, the suspicious medications, the pattern of fear surrounding Dr. Whitmore. Sarah listened without interruption, asking occasional questions that helped Ruby organize the evidence. Ruby, what you're describing sounds like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but worse. If this doctor is deliberately medicating a child to maintain a false diagnosis, Sarah's voice trailed off. The legal implications are staggering, but proving it will be nearly impossible without medical records, witness testimony, and physical evidence. The child witnessed her mother's death, Ruby said quietly. She told me Whitmore killed Catherine Hayes with an injection. She's been pretending to be blind for 3 years because he threatened to give her the sleeping medicine forever if she talked. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Ruby, if that's true, you're not just dealing with medical abuse, you're dealing with murder. And if this man realizes you know, the implication hung in the air like a poison cloud. Ruby thought of her small room, her isolation in this house full of strangers, her complete vulnerability to someone with Whitmore's power and connections. But then she thought of Isabella's terrified whisper in the music room, of the trust in those blue eyes when she'd called Ruby Mama Ruby in an unguarded moment. She thought of Marcus, of how she'd failed to save him when the system worked against them. She wouldn't fail another child. Sarah, I need you to document everything I've told you. Date and time, stamp it. If something happens to me, if I suddenly disappear or have an accident, you'll know why. Ruby, maybe you should just leave. Take the child and run. Where would we go? I'm a black woman with no legal standing, accused of kidnapping a white billionaire's daughter. They'd have us back within hours, and then there'd be no one left to protect her. Ruby spent the rest of the night documenting everything she'd observed, photographing the hidden drawings, researching Whitmore's background more thoroughly. What she found painted a picture of a man who'd built his career on the suffering of children from wealthy families, children whose parents were too trusting, too overwhelmed by grief, or too blinded by social status to question his methods. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. Over the past 20 years, at least 6 children from prominent Southern families had died or developed mysterious chronic conditions under Whitmore's care. The medical board had received complaints, but they'd been quietly dismissed or settled out of court. Whitmore's reputation, his connections, his carefully cultivated image as a devoted family physician had protected him from scrutiny. But Ruby also found something else. Court documents from a custody case 5 years earlier where a mother had accused Whitmore of over-medicating her son. The case had been thrown out when the woman suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown, but her testimony was preserved in the legal files. She'd described symptoms identical to what Ruby was seeing in Isabella: unexplained sedation, personality changes, and a doctor who insisted on private examinations without witnesses. Dawn was breaking over the magnolia trees when Ruby finally allowed herself to sleep, her phone hidden beneath her mattress with all the evidence she'd gathered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But she'd planted seeds of doubt, documented the truth, and created a paper trail that would be hard to erase. In her dreams, she saw Marcus standing in a field of sunflowers, his gap-toothed grin bright as summer. "You got this, Mama," he seemed to say. "Don't let the bad man hurt another baby." Ruby woke with tears on her cheeks and steel in her spine. The real battle was just beginning, but she was no longer fighting alone. Truth had a way of finding light, even in the darkest places, and she would make sure Isabella Hayes lived to see it. The morning brought Martha Washington to Ruby's room with a breakfast tray and eyes full of unspoken warning. "Child," the older woman whispered, "whatever you're planning, you better be careful. Dr. Whitmore's got eyes and ears everywhere in this town. He's not a man who forgives those who cross him." Ruby met her gaze steadily. "Neither am I, Miss Martha. Neither am I." The confrontation came 3 days later, arriving with the subtlety of a Georgia thunderstorm. Ruby was in Isabella's room, helping the child with what appeared to be a simple puzzle, but was actually a carefully designed test of visual acuity. Isabella's small fingers moved with impossible precision, placing each piece exactly where it belonged while maintaining the vacant stare that had fooled everyone for 3 years. "You're getting very good at this, little bird," Ruby whispered, using the pet name that had emerged naturally between them. Isabella's face brightened with the ghost of a smile, and for just a moment her blue eyes focused directly on Ruby's face with startling clarity. That's when Dr. Edmund Whitmore walked into the room unannounced, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor like a death knell. Ruby's heart slammed against her ribs as she watched Isabella's transformation, the instant return to vacant staring, the careful slumping of her shoulders, the practiced confusion that settled over her features like a mask. "Mrs. Johnson," Whitmore said, his cultured voice carrying an edge Ruby had never heard before. "How unexpected to find you conducting therapeutic activities with Isabella." The way he said therapeutic activities made them sound like criminal acts. Ruby straightened slowly, positioning herself between Whitmore and Isabella with protective instinct. "Just helping her with a puzzle, Doctor. Nothing more." Whitmore's gray eyes studied the puzzle pieces with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. Each piece had been placed with mathematical precision, creating a complex landscape that would challenge most adults. No truly blind child could have completed it so perfectly. "Fascinating," Whitmore murmured, stepping closer. "Isabella, darling, did you enjoy your puzzle?" The child's performance was flawless. The slight head tilt, the hesitant reaching toward the sound of his voice, the perfectly calibrated confusion. I don't know, sir. Mrs. Johnson helped me." But Ruby caught what others missed, the microscopic flinch when Whitmore's shadow fell across Isabella's face, the way her breathing quickened despite her outward calm. This child was terrified, and she was fighting that terror with every ounce of 7-year-old courage she possessed. "Mrs. Johnson," Whitmore continued, his attention shifting back to Ruby with predatory focus, "I wonder if we might have a private conversation, about Isabella's care, of course." Ruby's mouth went dry, but she nodded. "Of course, Doctor." They moved to the blue room, where the afternoon light streaming through tall windows seemed harsh and unforgiving. Whitmore closed the door behind them with deliberate precision, the soft click echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. "You've been here 2 weeks now," Whitmore began, settling into a wingback chair with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. "Samuel tells me you've had some interesting observations about Isabella's condition." Ruby remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "I've noticed she seems more responsive lately, more aware of her surroundings." Whitmore's smile was winter cold. "Yes, well, grief can make people see things that aren't there, particularly people who've suffered their own losses. You lost a child recently, didn't you, Mrs. Johnson?" The question hit like a physical blow. Ruby felt her professional mask slip for just a moment, revealing the raw wound that Marcus's death had left behind. "Yes, sir. I did. Cancer, wasn't it? Leukemia?" "Tragic, how these diseases ravage the young." Whitmore's voice carried false sympathy that made Ruby's skin crawl. "I imagine watching Isabella struggle with her own challenges must be triggering for you." Ruby recognized the psychological manipulation for what it was, an attempt to undermine her credibility, to paint her as an unreliable witness driven by her own trauma. She'd seen this tactic before, had been on the receiving end of it when she'd tried to advocate for better care for poor children in the hospital system. "My personal experiences don't change what I observe professionally," Ruby said carefully. "Isabella shows signs of visual awareness that seem inconsistent with complete blindness." Whitmore's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been practicing medicine for over 40 years. I delivered Isabella Hayes, diagnosed her condition, and have monitored her care since birth. Are you suggesting that my medical expertise is somehow inferior to your observations?" The word observations dripped with condescension. Ruby felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of having her intelligence questioned because of her race, her gender, her lack of formal credentials. But she thought of Isabella's terrified whisper in the music room, of the trust in those blue eyes when the child had called her Mama Ruby. "I'm not questioning your expertise, doctor. I'm simply sharing what I've noticed." Whitmore stood slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across Ruby's face. "Let me be very clear, Mrs. Johnson. Isabella Hayes is a severely traumatized child with complex medical needs. Her condition requires careful management by qualified professionals. Well-meaning but unqualified individuals who encourage false hope or contradict established medical protocols can cause tremendous psychological damage." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ruby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "I understand, doctor." "I hope you do." Whitmore moved closer, close enough that Ruby could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something clinical and cold. "Samuel has mentioned that you've been unusually interested in Isabella's medical history, asking questions about her treatments, her medications. That kind of curiosity can be dangerous in the wrong hands." Ruby's heart hammered so loudly she was certain Whitmore could hear it. "I just want what's best for Isabella." "Of course you do. That's why I'm going to recommend to Samuel that Isabella's care be transferred to specialists at the Children's Hospital in Atlanta. Residential treatment, round-the-clock supervision, the most advanced therapeutic interventions available." Whitmore's smile was sharp as a scalpel. "It would be kinder for everyone involved." The words hit Ruby like ice water. Residential treatment meant taking Isabella away from anyone who might notice inconsistencies, might ask uncomfortable questions. It was the perfect solution for someone with secrets to hide. "That seems extreme for a child who's been stable at home for years," Ruby said carefully. Whitmore's eyes glittered with something dangerous. "Stability is relative, Mrs. Johnson. Children can regress quickly under the wrong influences. Sometimes a change of environment and caregivers is exactly what's needed." The message was crystal clear. Stop asking questions, or Isabella would disappear into an institution where no one would ever believe her story. Ruby felt the walls closing in, felt the familiar helplessness of being outmaneuvered by someone with more power, more credentials, more social standing. But then she remembered the drawing hidden beneath Isabella's mattress, the terror captured in those pencil strokes. She thought of Catherine Hayes, whose accident might not have been accidental at all. She thought of Marcus, of how the system had failed him, of how she'd promised herself she wouldn't fail another child. "Dr. Whitmore," Ruby said, her voice steadier than she felt, "before any major changes are made to Isabella's care, shouldn't her father be fully informed about all the options? Maybe seek a second opinion from another specialist?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Whitmore's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally something that looked very much like rage. "Second opinions can be confusing for families in crisis," Whitmore said slowly. "Sometimes too many voices create uncertainty where clear direction is needed. Samuel trusts my judgment completely. He has for years, through his mother's final illness, through Catherine's tragic accident, through Isabella's ongoing challenges. Ruby caught the subtle emphasis on accident and felt her blood turn to ice. This man had just confessed without confessing, had revealed his role in Catherine's death through the very words he'd chosen to defend himself. "Of course," Ruby said, fighting to keep her voice neutral. "I'm sure Mr. Hayes appreciates having such a dedicated family physician." Whitmore studied her face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. Ruby felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through to her thoughts and plans. "Mrs. Johnson," Whitmore said finally, "I hope we understand each other. Isabella's well-being depends on stability, consistency, and proper medical supervision. Disruptions to her routine, questions about her care, challenges to established protocols can be deeply harmful to her psychological state." Ruby nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Excellent. Then I'm sure you'll continue to provide the supportive, unobtrusive care that Isabella needs. Nothing more, nothing less." Whitmore moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the brass knob. "Oh, and Mrs. Johnson, if you're ever uncertain about anything regarding Isabella's condition or treatment, please come to me directly. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings that might force us to reconsider your position here." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the seal on a tomb. Ruby stood alone in the blue room, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the back of a chair for support. She'd just been threatened by a man who'd murdered at least one person and was systematically abusing a child, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. Or was there? Ruby thought about the evidence she'd been gathering, the documentation she'd shared with Dr. Chen, the pattern of abuse that was becoming clearer every day. She thought about Martha Washington's knowing eyes, about the fear she'd seen in other staff members when Whitmore's name came up. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she felt. That evening, after Isabella was asleep, Ruby found Martha in the kitchen, preparing tea for Sam's evening routine. The older woman looked up as Ruby entered, her dark eyes full of questions. "Miss Martha?" Ruby said quietly. "How long have you known about Dr. Whitmore?" Martha's hands stilled on the tea service. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Martha set down the sugar bowl and looked directly at Ruby. "Since Miss Catherine's funeral," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I heard him tell Mr. Sam how peaceful she looked, how the accident had been so quick she wouldn't have suffered, but I saw her face in that casket, child. That wasn't the face of someone who died peaceful." Ruby's heart pounded as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. "Did you tell anyone?" Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell who? I'm a 62-year-old black woman who's worked in this house for 37 years. You think anybody gonna believe me over Dr. Edmund Whitmore?" The bitter truth of those words hit Ruby like a physical blow. They were both trapped by the same systems of power and privilege that had allowed Whitmore to operate with impunity for decades. "But Miss Catherine," Martha continued, "she knew something was wrong before she died? Kept asking me questions about Isabella's treatments, about why the child seemed so distant after her appointments with Dr. Whitmore. She was getting suspicious, asking too many questions." Ruby felt the pieces clicking together with terrible clarity. Catherine Hayes had discovered something about her daughter's treatment, had started questioning Whitmore's methods, and for that, she'd paid with her life. "Miss Martha," Ruby said, "if something happens to me, if I disappear or have an accident, you need to call this number." She pressed a slip of paper into the older woman's hands. "Dr. Sarah Chen in Atlanta. Tell her Ruby Mae Johnson sent you, and tell her everything you've told me." Martha's eyes widened with fear. "Child, what are you planning?" Ruby thought of Isabella sleeping upstairs, of the terror in those blue eyes, of the years of silence and pretended blindness. She thought of Marcus, of promises made and broken, of the system that protected predators while sacrificing children. "I'm planning to save that little girl," Ruby said. "Whatever it takes." The trap was set with the precision of a master chess player making his final move. Ruby discovered it the next morning when she arrived at Isabella's room to find it empty, the bed made with military precision, and Dr. Whitmore standing beside Sam Hayes like a vulture perched next to its prey. "Ah, Mrs. Johnson," Whitmore said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing Isabella's immediate transfer to Magnolia Hills Treatment Center in Atlanta." Ruby's blood turned to ice. Magnolia Hills was a private psychiatric facility for children, the kind of place where wealthy families sent their difficult offspring to disappear behind locked doors and chemical restraints. She'd heard whispers about it during her nursing days, stories of children who went in asking questions and came out as hollow-eyed shells of their former selves. "Transfer?" Ruby managed to keep her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. "Is Isabella having a medical emergency?" Sam's face was etched with the particular anguish of a father watching his child slip away. "She had another episode last night, talking nonsense about seeing things, claiming she could identify colors. Dr. Whitmore believes she's developing secondary psychosis from the trauma of her blindness." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that Ruby almost admired its evil brilliance. Whitmore had taken Isabella's moments of honesty, her desperate attempts to reveal the truth, and weaponized them into symptoms of mental illness. "Where is Isabella now?" Ruby asked. "Safe," Whitmore replied, and the single word carried more menace than a shouted threat. "She's being prepared for transport. The delusions have become quite severe. She's even claiming that I somehow hurt her mother, which is deeply concerning given Catherine's tragic accident." Ruby felt the walls closing in around her. Every move she'd made, every question she'd asked, every moment of progress with Isabella had been carefully catalogued and twisted into evidence of the child's deteriorating mental state. Whitmore had played this game before, had perfected the art of making truth sound like madness. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said, turning to Sam with desperate urgency, "before making such a drastic decision, wouldn't it be wise to seek a second opinion, another specialist who could evaluate Isabella independently?" Sam's eyes held the glazed look of a man drowning in his own grief and guilt. "Dr. Whitmore has been our family physician for decades, Mrs. Johnson. If he believes residential treatment is necessary—" "Sometimes the people closest to a situation can't see it clearly," Whitmore interjected smoothly. "Fresh eyes, objective assessment, 24-hour professional supervision, these are what Isabella needs now. The home environment has clearly become too stimulating for her fragile psychological state." Ruby recognized the masterful manipulation for what it was. Whitmore was using Sam's love for his daughter as a weapon against them both, convincing him that sending Isabella away was an act of paternal devotion rather than the ultimate betrayal. "I'd like to say goodbye to her," Ruby said, playing for time while her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. "I'm afraid that's not advisable," Whitmore replied. "Isabella has become quite attached to you, Mrs. Johnson, which has unfortunately contributed to her confusion. She seems to view you as some sort of maternal figure, which has exacerbated her existing psychological instabilities." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Ruby. Isabella's natural trust, her desperate need for protection and love, was being used as evidence of her mental incompetence. Every bond they'd formed, every moment of connection had been twisted into pathology. "The transport vehicle will arrive within the hour," Whitmore continued, checking his gold watch with theatrical precision. Isabella will receive the finest care available. Magnolia Hills specializes in cases exactly like hers, traumatic blindness complicated by secondary psychological disorders. Ruby felt the familiar burn of helpless rage, the same feeling she'd experienced when Marcus lay dying and she couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved him. The same feeling she'd had when hospital administrators dismissed her concerns about inadequate care for minority children. The system was rigged, had always been rigged, and she was just one woman with no power standing against centuries of entrenched privilege. But then she thought of Isabella's whispered confession in the music room. He gave Mama the sleeping medicine, and she never woke up. She thought of the terror in those blue eyes, of the 3 years of self-imposed darkness that a child had chosen rather than face the truth about her mother's murder. Ruby Mae Johnson had failed to save her own son, but she would not fail Isabella Hayes, not if it killed her. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded as a pediatric nurse, "I need to tell you something about your daughter's condition. Something Dr. Whitmore doesn't want you to know." Whitmore's face went white with rage. "Mrs. Johnson, I must insist that you not burden Samuel with the delusional fantasies of a traumatized child. This is exactly the kind of misguided interference that—" "Isabella can see," Ruby said, her words cutting through Whitmore's protests like a blade through silk. "She's been pretending to be blind for 3 years because Dr. Whitmore threatened her. She witnessed her mother's murder, and he's been keeping her silent with drugs and fear." The silence that followed was deafening. Sam stared at Ruby as if she'd sprouted wings, his face cycling through disbelief, hope, and dawning horror. Whitmore's mask of professional concern finally slipped, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "This is exactly what I was warning you about, Samuel," Whitmore said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Mrs. Johnson has clearly developed an unhealthy obsession with Isabella, projecting her own grief onto our family. These accusations are the product of a disturbed mind." But Sam was no longer looking at Whitmore. His gaze was fixed on Ruby with the intensity of a drowning man spotting a life-preserver. "What are you saying about Catherine's death?" "I'm saying it wasn't an accident," Ruby replied, knowing she was signing her own death warrant but unable to stop the words from pouring out. "Isabella saw Dr. Whitmore give your wife an injection. She's been living in terror ever since, pretending to be blind because he told her bad things happen to little girls who tell secrets." Whitmore laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Samuel, surely you can see how ridiculous this is. A grief-stricken domestic worker, fired from her previous position for insubordination, making wild accusations against a respected physician. This is a textbook case of displaced trauma and racial paranoia." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Ruby saw doubt creep back into Sam's eyes, saw him remembering her background, her loss, her lack of credentials. The familiar patterns of power and privilege were reasserting themselves, painting her as the unreliable narrator, the uppity black woman who didn't know her place. "Where is Isabella right now?" Ruby demanded, desperation making her voice sharp. "If she's really having a psychiatric emergency, why isn't she here? Why can't her father see her?" "She's being sedated," Whitmore replied smoothly. "For her own safety and the safety of others. Her delusions have made her quite agitated." The word sedated hit Ruby like a physical blow. She thought of Isabella's glassy eyes after Whitmore's previous visit, of the child's slurred speech and sluggish responses. How many times had he drugged that little girl into compliance? How many injections had he justified as medical necessity while slowly poisoning her mind and body? "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said, turning back to Sam with one final desperate appeal, "ask yourself why your daughter never gets better. Why she never shows any improvement despite years of treatment. Ask yourself why Dr. Whitmore is so insistent on taking her away right now, today, without giving you time to think or seek other opinions. For a moment, something flickered in Sam's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of recognition. But then Whitmore spoke again, his voice carrying all the authority of his position, his race, his gender, his decades of unchallenged power. Samuel, I understand this is difficult, but we cannot allow delusional thinking to cloud our judgment. Isabella needs professional help, and she needs it now. Every moment we delay puts her at greater risk of complete psychological breakdown. Ruby watched Sam's face close off, saw him retreat back into the comfortable certainty of trusting authority, of believing that expensive credentials trumped inconvenient truths. The moment of possibility died like a candle flame snuffed out by a cold wind. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson," Sam said, his voice hollow with defeat. "I think it's best if you pack your things. Dr. Whitmore will handle Isabella's transfer, and I'll arrange for your final payment." Ruby felt the familiar sting of dismissal, of being discarded the moment she became inconvenient. She thought of Marcus, of all the children she'd failed to save, of the system that protected predators while sacrificing the innocent. But as she turned to leave, Ruby made a silent promise to the empty room, to the ghost of Catherine Hayes, and to the terrified child who was about to disappear into an institutional nightmare. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Mr. Hayes," Ruby said, pausing at the doorway, "when you realize what you've done, and you will realize it, remember that you had a choice. Remember that someone tried to tell you the truth, and you chose not to listen." She walked out of Hayes Manor with her head held high, her single suitcase in hand, and her heart breaking for the child she was leaving behind. But Ruby Mae Johnson wasn't giving up. She was regrouping, planning, and preparing for a war that would either save Isabella Hayes or destroy them all. The real battle was just beginning. Ruby Mae Johnson sat in the cramped Greyhound station in downtown Savannah, her single suitcase at her feet and her phone pressed against her ear with trembling fingers. The afternoon heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket, but the chill in her bones had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the terrible knowledge that Isabella Hayes was about to disappear forever into Whitmore's web of lies. "Dr. Chen, thank God you answered," Ruby whispered into the phone, conscious of the strangers around her who might be listening. "He's moving her today. Isabella's being transferred to Magnolia Hills, and once she's behind those locked doors—" "Ruby, slow down," Dr. Sarah Chen's voice cut through the static. "Are you safe? Where are you?" "Bus station. He had me fired, painted me as some kind of delusional grieving mother. Sam Hayes believed every word." Ruby's voice cracked with frustration and fury. "That bastard played it perfectly. Used my loss of Marcus against me, made my concerns sound like racial paranoia and misplaced maternal instincts." Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible through the connection. "Ruby, I've been doing research since our last conversation. The pattern you described, it's not just Isabella. I found at least 4 other cases over the past decade where children from wealthy families developed mysterious conditions under Whitmore's care. All of them ended up in long-term residential facilities." Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs. "Are they still alive?" "That's just it. I can't find records of what happened to them after institutionalization. Patient privacy laws make it nearly impossible to trace, but Ruby, 2 of those families had mothers who died in accidents within months of questioning their children's treatment." The words hit Ruby like ice water. Catherine Hayes wasn't Whitmore's first victim. She was part of a pattern stretching back years, a systematic elimination of anyone who got too close to the truth. "Sarah, I need you to contact the FBI. Medical kidnapping, Medicare fraud, possible murder. This is way beyond local jurisdiction. Already on it. I have a contact at the Bureau's Healthcare Fraud Division. But Ruby, they'll need evidence, witnesses, something concrete to build a case on. Ruby thought of Isabella's hidden drawings, of Martha Washington's frightened whispers, of the terror in a 7-year-old's eyes when she'd whispered the truth about her mother's death. All of it circumstantial, all of it easily dismissed by a man with Whitmore's credentials and connections. The transport to Magnolia Hills, Ruby said suddenly. What if it never arrives? Ruby, no. Whatever you're thinking, don't. I'm not talking about violence, Sarah. I'm talking about creating a situation where the truth has to come out. Where Whitmore can't hide behind medical authority and Sam Hayes has to face what he's allowed to happen to his daughter. Ruby ended the call and immediately dialed another number she'd memorized from her research, the direct line to Channel 7 News, Savannah's most aggressive investigative journalism team. If legal channels were too slow, if the system was too corrupted to protect one terrified child, then Ruby would drag the truth into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Channel 7 News, this is Maria Santos. Ms. Santos, my name is Ruby Johnson, and I have information about Dr. Edmund Whitmore and medical abuse of children from wealthy families. Are you interested in a story that could win you a Pulitzer Prize? 20 minutes later, Ruby was sitting across from Maria Santos in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the news station. Maria was younger than Ruby had expected, maybe 35, with the sharp eyes and predatory instincts of someone who'd built her career on exposing corruption. You're telling me that one of Savannah's most respected physicians has been systematically drugging children to maintain false medical diagnoses? Maria's pen flew across her notepad as she spoke. I'm telling you that Isabella Hayes has been pretending to be blind for 3 years because she witnessed Dr. Whitmore murder her mother. I'm telling you that right now, today. That child is being transported to a psychiatric facility where she'll be drugged into silence permanently. Ruby pulled out her phone and showed Maria the photographs she'd taken of Isabella's hidden drawings. No blind child could have drawn these. Look at the detail, the accurate proportions. This is the work of someone who can see perfectly. Maria studied the images with growing excitement. These are incredible. But I'll need corroboration, other sources. Can you get me in touch with other staff members at Hayes Manor? Martha Washington, the head housekeeper. She's been there 37 years, saw Catherine Hayes in her casket, knew something wasn't right about her death. Ruby wrote down Martha's number with shaking hands. But you have to move fast. Isabella's transport leaves in less than 2 hours. What exactly are you asking me to do? Ruby met Maria's gaze steadily. I'm asking you to save a child's life. And if you move fast enough, I can give you the story of the century. An hour later, Channel 7's news van was racing through downtown Savannah toward Hayes Manor, followed by a second vehicle carrying Maria Santos and her camera crew. Ruby sat in the passenger seat of the news van, her heart hammering as she watched the familiar landscape blur past the windows. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. FBI agent wants to speak with you. Healthcare Fraud Division taking this seriously? Need you to stay safe until they can build a case. But Ruby knew there wasn't time for careful case building, for proper procedures and bureaucratic protocols. Isabella was running out of time, and every minute that passed took her further away from rescue and closer to disappearing forever into Whitmore's institutional nightmare. The news van pulled up to Hayes Manor just as a white medical transport vehicle was backing up to the front entrance. Through the van's tinted windows, Ruby watched 2 men in scrubs wheel a gurney toward the vehicle. On that gurney, strapped down and clearly sedated, was Isabella Hayes. There, Ruby whispered, her voice breaking. That's her. Jesus Christ, look what he's done to that baby. Maria Santos was already out of the van, microphone in hand, her camera crew flanking her as she approached the transport team with the focused intensity of a shark scenting blood. Excuse me. I'm Maria Santos with Channel 7 News. Can you tell our viewers about the medical transport you're conducting today? The transport technicians looked confused and nervous, clearly unprepared for media attention. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, glanced back at Isabella's unconscious form with obvious discomfort. We're just doing our job, ma'am. Transport to Magnolia Hills. Orders from Dr. Whitmore. And what's the patient's condition that requires such heavy sedation? Before the technician could answer, Dr. Whitmore himself emerged from the house, his face white with rage at seeing the news crew. Behind him came Sam Hayes, looking like a man walking to his own execution. "This is a private medical matter," Whitmore snapped at Maria. "You have no right to interfere with patient care." Ruby stepped out of the news van, and the moment Sam Hayes saw her, his face crumpled with something that looked like recognition of his own terrible mistake. "Mr. Hayes?" Maria called out, her microphone extended toward him. "Can you explain why your 7-year-old daughter is being transported to a psychiatric facility while heavily sedated?" Dr. Whitmore says she needs specialized care." Sam's voice was barely audible, his eyes fixed on Isabella's unconscious form on the gurney. "Dr. Whitmore," Maria continued, turning her attention to the physician, "how do you respond to allegations that Isabella Hayes has been misdiagnosed with blindness and that her psychiatric symptoms are actually the result of witnessing her mother's murder?" The words hit like bombs exploding in the summer air. Whitmore's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, and finally, cold calculation. "These are the delusional fantasies of a dismissed employee with a history of mental instability," Whitmore said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Mrs. Johnson was terminated for erratic behavior and inappropriate interference with patient care." But Ruby saw something else happening. The transport technician with the kind eyes was looking back and forth between Isabella's sedated form and the adults arguing around her. Something in his expression suggested he was beginning to question what he'd been told about this particular transport. "Isabella!" Ruby called out, moving closer to the gurney despite Whitmore's attempts to block her. "Little bird, can you hear me? It's Mama Ruby. You're safe now, sweetheart. Tell them the truth about what you saw." And then, like a miracle breaking through the darkness, Isabella's eyelids fluttered open. Isabella's eyes opened like blue flowers blooming in the harsh Georgia sunlight, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked directly at the world around her, without pretense or fear. Her gaze found Ruby's face with laser precision, then swept across the crowd of adults surrounding her gurney with an awareness that no blind child could possibly possess. "Mama Ruby," Isabella whispered, her voice still thick from sedation but carrying unmistakable recognition. "You came back for me." The words hit the assembled crowd like lightning. Sam Hayes stumbled backward as if physically struck, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. The transport technician with the kind eyes stepped back from the gurney, his hand moving instinctively to unbuckle the restraints that held Isabella down. "She can see," Sam breathed, his voice breaking on each word. "My God, she can see." Dr. Whitmore's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. "She's hallucinating from the medication," he snapped, reaching for Isabella's IV line. "The sedatives can cause temporary visual delusions. This proves exactly why she needs intensive psychiatric intervention." But Isabella turned her head toward Whitmore with the focused attention of someone tracking movement, her blue eyes widening with terror as she recognized the voice that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. "Don't let the needleman hurt me," Isabella pleaded, looking directly at her father for the first time since her mother's death. "Daddy, he gave Mama the sleeping medicine that made her go to heaven. He said if I told anyone, he'd make me sleep forever too." The confession hung in the summer air like smoke from a gun. Maria Santos's camera crew captured every second as Sam Hayes fell to his knees beside his daughter's gurney, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his failure crashed over him. "Isabella, baby girl, I'm so sorry," Sam whispered, his hands shaking as he touched her face. "I should have listened. I should have protected you." Ruby moved to the other side of the gurney, her own tears flowing freely as she took Isabella's small hand in hers. "You're safe now, little bird. You're safe, and you never have to pretend to be blind again." Dr. Whitmore made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. "This is mass hysteria," he declared to the news cameras. "A confused child, a grieving father, and a dismissed employee with delusions of grandeur. I won't allow this circus to continue." But his words fell on deaf ears. The transport technician was already removing Isabella's restraints, and in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of federal agents who would finally bring justice to Hayes Manor. As Isabella sat up on the gurney and truly saw her father's face for the first time in 3 years, Ruby Mae Johnson knew that sometimes truth really could triumph over power. Love could conquer fear, and one determined woman could indeed save a child's life. The nightmare was finally over, and Isabella Hayes was free to see the world in all its beautiful, complicated, wonderful truth. Sometimes the most profound happiness comes not from what we gain, but from what we choose to protect. Ruby Mae Johnson lost her own precious son Marcus to a system that valued wealth over compassion, yet she found the courage to save another mother's child when it mattered most. In a world that often tells us our voices don't matter, especially when we're older, when we've faced loss, when society tries to diminish our worth, Ruby proved that one person's determination can shatter years of lies and corruption. Her story reminds us that the greatest joy isn't in our achievements or accumulations, but in those moments when we stand up for what's right, when we refuse to let innocence be destroyed, when we choose love over fear. Isabella's freedom came because someone cared enough to listen, to observe, to act. Ruby didn't need credentials or connections. She needed only the fierce love that comes from understanding a child's pain. As we navigate our golden years, we carry wisdom earned through decades of living. Sometimes the most beautiful legacy we can leave is knowing we used that wisdom to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. True happiness lives in knowing we made a difference when it counted most. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to stand up for someone when others wouldn't listen? What gives you the courage to speak truth even when it's difficult?